The sign, a classic bright red and white affair, declared the store's presence in bold, familiar lettering. For decades, it had been a symbol of convenience, of affordable goods and late-night emergencies. It was the place where families bought their weekly groceries, where teenagers impulsively grabbed candy, where tired parents sought refuge from the drudgery of meal preparation. It was mundane, ordinary, the very epitome of small-town normalcy. But Martha no longer saw it that way. The elders, in their fragmented accounts and cryptic warnings, had spoken of anchors. Not physical objects, but places, points of convergence where the veil between their world and the realm of the Shadow Eater was thinnest. These were not necessarily sacred sites in the traditional sense, but locations that, through some twist of fate or intentional design, had become imbued with an unnatural resonance. The scar, of course, was the prime example, a wound in the very fabric of reality. But there were lesser points, nodes of influence that the ancient entity could exploit, used to extend its tendrils, to draw sustenance, or to whisper its corrupting influence. And now, Martha saw the Fred Myers sign as one such anchor, perhaps even a focal point. Its relentless artificial glow seemed to bleed into the fog, making it appear thicker, more opaque, as if it were actively resisting the natural dispersal of the mist. The neon lights, the very mechanism of its visibility, now struck her as a perverse imitation of life, a cold, manufactured spark that mimicked the warmth it was meant to represent. It was a lure, she realized with a sickening lurch, a beacon designed to draw people into the very maw of whatever darkness resided within. She remembered her grandmother, a woman of quiet stoicism and deep-seated faith, speaking of the sign in her later years. "It never looks right when the fog rolls in," she'd say, a hint of unease in her voice. "Like it's trying to swallow the light, not shine through it." At the time, Martha had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman, her eyesight failing, her mind prone to superstition. Now, those words echoed with the chilling clarity of prophecy. The sign wasn't just failing to shine through the fog, it was part of the fog. Or rather, it was a conduit that allowed the unnatural fog and the entity it concealed to manifest more strongly. The elders' tales weren't about abstract concepts of evil. They were grounded in the tangible realities of their valley. They spoke of specific locations, of crossroads where the air grew heavy, of ancient trees that seemed to weep a dark sap, of springs that ran with water too cold, too still. They had a visceral understanding of the land, of its subtle shifts, its hidden energies. And Martha, by immersing herself in their lore, had begun to see Havendale through their eyes. The familiar had become alien, the mundane imbued with an ancient dread. The Fred Meyer, in its ubiquity, was the perfect hiding place for such a power. Who would suspect a grocery store, a place of everyday commerce, of harboring a malevolent entity? Its very ordinariness was its greatest defense, a camouflage that rendered it invisible to all but those who understood the deeper currents flowing beneath the surface of Havendale. The bright, welcoming facade was a carefully constructed lie, a shimmering veil designed to obscure the rot within. Martha traced the outline of the sign with her eyes, imagining the unseen currents of energy that the elders described. They spoke of a feeding that wasn't always physical, a draining of spirit, of hope, of vitality. And what better place to siphon such things than from a place designed for the sustenance of life itself? The constant flow of people, their mundane desires, their fleeting interactions, it all created a rich tapestry of emotional and spiritual energy, a buffet for an entity that fed on the essence of living things. The sign, with its persistent glow, acted as a kind of olfactory bulb for this ancient predator, an invitation to the unsuspecting prey. She recalled the specific details of the disappearances that had occurred within the store's vicinity, the missing persons reports that had been filed over the years. They weren't always dramatic, headline-grabbing events. Often they were quiet, almost unnoticed departures. People who simply walked out and never returned, their cars found abandoned in the parking lot, their belongings left behind. The police, of course, had always attributed these to runaway cases, to unfortunate accidents, to the harsh realities of life outside the sheltered valley. But Martha now saw a pattern, a deliberate selection. The entity anchored by the sign was subtly influencing those it wished to claim, drawing them in with an irresistible, unseen pull, a whisper of oblivion disguised as a final errand. The neon lights flickered, a brief stutter in their relentless hum. For a split second, the red glow intensified, bathing the fog-choked parking lot in an almost blood-red hue. Martha felt a primal chill crawl up her spine, a visceral reaction that had nothing to do with the damp air. It was the feeling of being watched, of being known. The sign wasn't just a passive anchor. It was an active participant, a sentient eye observing the world, waiting for its moment. The elders had warned that the entity didn't always operate through grand gestures. Its power lay in subtlety, in manipulation, in the slow erosion of will. It could amplify desires, foster anxieties, create an overwhelming sense of despair that would lead an individual to seek out a place of solace. And what seemed more solitary, more self-contained, than the aisles of a well-stocked grocery store, especially late at night, under the shroud of a thick fog. The sign, in its perpetual, artificial brightness, offered a promise of a contained, controlled environment, a stark contrast to the disorienting embrace of the mist. It was a trap, disguised as a sanctuary. Martha imagined the first inhabitants of Havendale, their desperate attempts to understand and contain the burgeoning darkness. They wouldn't have erected grand monuments or performed elaborate exorcisms. Their methods would have been more elemental, more intuitive. They would have sought to understand the points of weakness, the places where the entity's influence was strongest, and then they would have tried to mask them, to neutralize them, or perhaps in their desperation, to harness them. Was it possible? She wondered that the Fred Meyer, or at least the land it occupied, had been chosen by the early settlers for some reason. A natural nexus point, perhaps, that they had tried to consecrate or control, only to have their efforts twisted and perverted by the very entity they sought to appease or defy. The neon tubes hummed again, a steady, unwavering sound that now felt like a lullaby of dread. The red letters, so familiar, so commonplace, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, each flicker a heartbeat of the ancient darkness that had taken root in Havendale. It wasn't just a sign, it was a sigil, a marker etched into the psyche of the town, drawing the unwary towards an oblivion they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The history, Martha realized, wasn't just something buried in dusty scrolls and forgotten oral traditions. It was alive, imprinted on the very landscape, manifesting in the most unexpected of places, a chilling reminder that the past, when touched by true darkness, never truly stayed buried. It waited, patient and hungry, for the right sign to signal its return. And the Fred Meyer sign, she was now certain, was that sign. It was the beacon that drew the lost, the anchor that held the ancient evil, the visible manifestation of the encroaching shadow eater. The air in the archives of the Havendale Historical Society was thick with the scent of aging paper and forgotten stories. Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose pragmatic nature usually kept him tethered to the tangible, found himself wading through the ghosts of the town's past. He was here on a hunch, a nagging intuition that the current horrors, the unsettling strangeness that had begun to grip Havendale, might have roots far deeper and more human than the supernatural whispers suggested. He'd heard the hushed conversations in the diner, the fearful glances exchanged between older residents, all pointing to a darkness that predated the fog, a darkness that had a name, Tanny Tater. The files were sparse, tucked away in a manila folder stamped with the faded ink of decades past. The name itself was a grim, almost nonsensical moniker, a grotesque nursery rhyme for a monstrous reality. Tanny Tater, born Thomas Peterson, had been a shadow that loomed over Havendale in the late 1970s and early 1980s. His crimes, now relegated to the annals of local folklore, with the stuff of nightmares that clung to the collective memory of the town like a persistent chill. He wasn't a phantom or an entity from another dimension. He was pure, unadulterated human evil, and in its own way that was far more terrifying. Corbin carefully opened the folder. The first item was a brittle newspaper clipping, the headline screaming in bold, blocky letters, "Grisly Discovery Shocks Town. Fourth victim found." The accompanying photograph, black and white and grainy, showed a cluster of grim-faced police officers surveying a desolate stretch of woods on the outskirts of Havendale. Even in the faded image, Corbin could sense the suffocating dread that had permeated the valley during Tanny Tater's reign of terror. The article detailed the brutality of the attacks, the sheer savagery that had left Havendale reeling. The victims, 4 young women over a span of 18 months, had been found in various secluded locations, their bodies bearing the hallmarks of a disturbingly intimate violence. The details, when Corbin delved into the more official police reports, were sickening. Tanny Tater's signature method, the one that sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened investigators of the time, involved a common household object twisted into a weapon of horrific purpose, the handle of a wagon. The reports spoke of blunt force trauma, of a brutal, relentless beating that spoke of a primal rage. He would stalk his victims, often in the twilight hours when shadows lengthened and the familiar landscape of Havendale became imbued with a disquieting uncertainty. Then, in the quiet, vulnerable spaces of the town, a secluded park, a deserted logging trail, the edge of the old quarry, he would strike. The sheer, unthinking violence of his attacks was a chilling testament to a mind unburdened by empathy or remorse. It wasn't about the kill alone, it was about the act of inflicting pain, about the raw power he wielded in those moments. The article continued, detailing the growing panic within the community. Doors were locked earlier, children were kept indoors after dusk, and the once familiar streets of Havendale became empty and silent as darkness fell. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The fear of the unknown externalized into a palpable distrust of anyone who seemed even slightly out of the ordinary. Tanny Tater, though his identity remained a mystery for so long, had become an omnipresent spectre, a bogeyman conjured from the collective nightmares of a terrified town. He represented the worst that humanity could harbor, a darkness that festered not in some distant abstract realm, but right here, in their own backyards. Another clipping detailed the eventual capture of Thomas Peterson. The sensational headlines spoke of a desperate manhunt that had culminated in a fiery confrontation. Peterson, cornered in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town, had set the structure ablaze, preferring a self-immolation to capture. He had survived the inferno, but not without horrific consequences. The article described him as severely disfigured, his face and body bearing the indelible marks of the fire. Even in his capture, he seemed to court a perverse form of martyrdom, choosing to be burned rather than to face the justice he so richly deserved.